The garden that never lied. In the village of Rosmere, time did not move so much as it settled, like dust upon polished wood or petals upon carefully trimmed hedges. It was a place where habits were cherished, where routines were followed with quiet devotion, and where nothing truly surprising was ever expected to happen. And yet, as Miss Marple often reflected, such places were rarely as innocent as they appeared. The morning she arrived in Rosmere was bright, touched with the early warmth of spring. The sort of morning that made one believe, perhaps foolishly, that the world was kind and predictable. She had been invited by an old acquaintance, Mrs. Eleanor Finch, a woman whose letters were always as neat and composed as her reputation. Mrs. Finch had written of Rosmere's gardens. "You would adore them," she had said in her careful slanted handwriting. "They are our pride. Every house keeps a garden, but none so admired as Mrs. Althea Whitcomb's. It is quite simply perfection." Miss Marple had smiled at that. Perfection, she knew, was a dangerous word. When she arrived at the Finch residence, a modest but charming cottage with pale blue shutters and an overgrown ivy wall, she was greeted warmly. Mrs. Finch was exactly as Miss Marple remembered her, precise in movement, gentle in tone, and with an expression that always suggested she knew more than she said. "You've come at the perfect time," Mrs. Finch said, leading her inside. "The whole village is quite alive this week. The flower exhibition is only days away." Miss Marple set down her gloves neatly. "And I suppose Mrs. Whitcomb is expected to win. Yeah, as always?" Mrs. Finch hesitated. Only for a moment, but it did not escape Miss Marple's notice. "She usually does," she replied. "Though, there has been some talk." "Talk?" Miss Marple echoed lightly. "Oh, nothing of importance," Mrs. Finch said, a little too quickly. "You know how people are. Idle chatter. Still, you shall see the gardens for yourself. They are quite remarkable." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, but her interest had already been stirred. Idle chatter, she had learned, was rarely idle. Mrs. Althea Whitcomb lived at the edge of the village, where the cottages gave way to wider stretches of land and quieter paths. Her house, Rosewood Manor, stood with a quiet dignity, neither grand nor modest, but possessing an air of careful maintenance and understated wealth. It was the garden, however, that truly set it apart. Miss Marple visited the following afternoon, accompanied by Mrs. Finch, who insisted it would be a shame to delay such a sight. The gates were wrought iron, painted a deep green that blended seamlessly with the hedges surrounding the property. As they stepped through, Miss Marple felt an immediate shift, an almost imperceptible stillness that seemed to settle over the place. The garden unfolded like a painting. Every path was perfectly edged, every flower bed arranged with an artist's precision. Roses climbed elegantly along trellises, their colours ranging from soft ivory to deep crimson. Lavender bushes lined the walkways, their scent drifting gently in the air. There were tulips in orderly rows, daisies in cheerful clusters, and delicate bluebells hidden beneath the shade of old trees. It was, undeniably, beautiful. But there was something else, something controlled. "Isn't it extraordinary?" Mrs. Finch said softly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her gaze moving slowly across the arrangement. "Extraordinary indeed." A woman approached them from the far end of the path. She was dressed in a pale lilac gown, simple but elegant, and her silver-streaked hair was pinned neatly at the back. Her posture was upright, her movements measured. There was a calmness about her, one that bordered on something more deliberate. "Mrs. Whitcomb," Mrs. Finch called gently. The woman smiled. "My dear Eleanor," she said, her voice smooth and composed, "and you must be Miss Marple. I have heard a great deal about you." Miss Marple returned the smile with quiet warmth. "I hope nothing too alarming." "On the contrary," Mrs. Whitcomb said, "only that you are observant. Ye are a rare and valuable quality." Miss Marple thought that an interesting choice of words. They walked together through the garden, Mrs. Whitcomb speaking of her flowers with a calm, almost detached pride. She knew each plant intimately, its needs, its habits, its peculiarities. There was no doubt that the garden was her life's work. And yet Miss Marple could not help but notice something beneath it all, a certain tension. It revealed itself in small ways. The slight tightening of Mrs. Whitcomb's smile when Mrs. Finch mentioned the upcoming exhibition, the brief pause before she answered certain questions, the way her eyes flickered, Not often, but just enough, toward the far corner of the garden, where a tall hedge stood thicker than the rest. "Do you often receive visitors?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Not particularly," Mrs. Whitcomb replied. "I prefer my privacy." "A sensible preference," Miss Marple said, "though one wonders. Such beauty must attract admiration." "Admiration," Mrs. Whitcomb repeated, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes, it does." There was something in the way she said it that made Miss Marple glance at her more closely. Admiration, she thought, was not always a comfortable thing. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple lingered for a moment near the far hedge. It was, she noticed, slightly uneven, unlike the rest of the garden. One section appeared to have been recently disturbed, though it had been carefully trimmed to conceal it. "Something caught your eye?" Mrs. Whitcomb asked, appearing beside her. Miss Marple smiled lightly. "Only the hedge. It seems a touch less orderly than the rest." For a fraction of a second, so brief it might have been imagined, Mrs. Whitcomb's expression changed. Then it was gone. "Even perfection requires adjustment from time to time," she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course." But as they left the garden, she found herself thinking not of the flowers, nor the paths, nor even the quiet pride of their owner. She thought of that hedge, and of the way Mrs. Whitcomb had looked at it. The following morning, Rosemary awoke not to the gentle rhythm of routine, but to something far more disruptive. The news spread quickly, as such things always did. Mrs. Althea Whitcomb had been found in her garden, dead. They said she was lying among the roses, her expression strangely peaceful. There were no signs of struggle, and with no immediate indication of violence. At first glance, it might have been taken for a natural passing, a quiet end in a place she loved. But there was one detail that unsettled everyone. The doctor, upon examination, had shaken his head. "Poison," he had said. The word moved through the village like a shadow. Poison, in a place so carefully controlled, in a garden that never lied. Miss Marple sat by the window of Mrs. Finch's cottage, her knitting resting quietly in her lap. Outside, the village buzzed with speculation, fear, and the beginnings of suspicion. Mrs. Finch stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly. "It doesn't make sense," she said. "Who would do such a thing, and why?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Her eyes were distant, thoughtful. "In my experience," she said at last, "it is not the garden we must look at, but the gardener." She paused, then added softly, "and those who admired it a little too closely." Outside, the wind stirred gently through the trees, and somewhere, beyond the neatly trimmed hedges and carefully arranged flowers, something long buried had begun to rise. Part 2. Whispers Beneath the Roses. By noon, the whole of Rosemere had rearranged itself around the fact of death. Nothing in a village changed outwardly so quickly as conversation. Curtains twitched with greater purpose, footsteps slowed near gates, and people who had never shown any particular interest in one another's affairs now found urgent reasons to exchange observations in lowered voices. The postman lingered. The grocer's wife forgot to wrap 2 parcels. Even the vicar, who spoke gently of Christian fortitude and the mystery of providence, seemed a trifle more attentive than usual to the little knots of parishioners gathered after morning prayers. Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting in the front room of Mrs. Finch's cottage, heard enough of it through the open window to form a rough early pattern. A tragic accident. No, not an accident. Murder. Poison, they said. But how? And by whom? Surely not by anyone in Rosemere. That last phrase, Miss Marple reflected, was almost always the most revealing. People clung to the idea that wickedness came from outside. It was so much more comfortable to imagine a stranger with cruel intentions than a familiar face at a neighbouring tea table. Mrs. Finch had spent the morning in a state of troubled activity, or moving from room to room as though she had mislaid peace of mind and might yet find it between the teacups and the sideboard drawers. "I cannot bear to think of her there," she said at last, stopping by the mantel, among the roses. She loved that garden more than anything. "Not more than anything," said Miss Marple quietly. Mrs. Finch turned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "People rarely love one thing only, my dear. When they appear to do so, it is often because the other things they love are too painful, too dangerous, or too disappointing to acknowledge in public." Mrs. Finch gave a faint, unsettled sigh. You always did see rather farther than the rest of us." "No," said Miss Marple mildly. "Only I have lived long enough to notice that people are very much alike, however decorative their surroundings may be." There was a knock at the door before Mrs. Finch could reply. Their visitor proved to be Inspector Hale, a tall man with fair hair beginning to recede and the careful manner of someone who preferred solid facts to village temperament. Miss Marple approved of him at once, though she could tell he was a little wary of old ladies with reputations for noticing things. "Mrs. Finch, Miss Marple." He inclined his head politely. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," said Mrs. Finch. "Please do come in." He accepted tea because Englishmen in difficult situations nearly always did, and because refusing it in a village drawing room introduced an unnecessary sense of alarm. "I understand," he said after a moment, "that you both visited Mrs. Whitcomb yesterday afternoon." "We did," said Miss Marple. Inspector Hale took out a small notebook, though Miss Marple suspected he had already memorised more than he wrote down. "Did either of you notice anything unusual?" Mrs. Finch looked pained. "Nothing that seemed important at the time." Miss Marple let a row of stitches pass through her fingers. "That is so often the case." The inspector's eyes shifted to her. "Something occurred to you?" "Several things," said Miss Marple, "though whether they are useful is another matter. Mrs. Whitcomb was composed, perhaps too composed. She was a woman accustomed to order, yet beneath that order there was strain, the sort one sees when a person is determined not to think about a particular subject, and therefore cannot think of anything else." Inspector Hale regarded her with more attention now. "Did she mention any trouble?" "No. But she reacted noticeably when I spoke of visitors, and again when I paused near a hedge at the far side of the garden." "A hedge?" "Yes. One section had been disturbed recently. It had been tidied, but not in quite the same spirit as the rest." Mrs. Finch added quickly, "Althea said perfection needed adjustment from time to time." Inspector Hale made a note. "I see." He hesitated before asking his next question. "Did Mrs. Whitcomb have enemies?" Mrs. Finch looked shocked, but Miss Marple answered at once. "Most certainly." The inspector blinked. "You say that very confidently." "My dear Inspector, every person of consequence has enemies. Not always grand enemies," said Miss Marple. "Sometimes merely those who feel overlooked, resentful, or unfairly managed. Such emotions do not require melodrama." "They flourish quite well over luncheon." He almost smiled. "Locally, then?" he asked. "Almost certainly," said Miss Marple. When he had gone, Mrs. Finch sank into a chair. "You make it sound so dreadful, as though one can never really know anyone." "One can know a great deal," said Miss Marple, "but one must remember that affection and truth are not always the same thing. The funeral talk began before there was any funeral to arrange. That too was natural. Death invited management. Practical tasks gave structure to alarm. But beneath the arrangements there moved other currents, and it was those currents that interested Miss Marple. That afternoon she proposed a short walk into the village. Mrs. Finch, who knew perfectly well that a short walk in Miss Marple's company might involve a remarkable amount of useful listening, put on her hat without protest. Rosemere wore shock neatly. People looked grave, but not yet disordered. In villages, Miss Marple had often observed, a murder did not at first destroy routine, it sharpened it. At the florist's window, several women stood speaking together. Their voices fell as Miss Marple approached, then rose again with a strained brightness. At the bakery, Mr. Pritchard, the owner, leaned across the counter to tell a customer that poor Mrs. Whitcomb had always purchased seed cakes on Thursdays, without fail, regular as the post. He spoke as though consistency itself had been murdered. Near the green they encountered Dr. Bellamy, a lean man with intelligent eyes and the weary look of someone whose profession required him to handle both bodies and nerves. "How is everyone bearing up?" asked Mrs. Finch. "As badly as they can while remaining respectable," said the doctor dryly. Then, softening a little, "It is an ugly business." Miss Marple studied him. "You're certain it was poison?" "Yes." "Administered how?" Dr. Bellamy looked at her keenly. "You go straight to the centre of things, Miss Marple." "It saves time." He lowered his voice. "Not by injection, not forced, most likely taken orally. There were traces consistent with a plant-derived toxin. We're waiting for further analysis, but I should say she consumed it not long before death." "Tea?" suggested Mrs. Finch faintly. "Possibly. A cordial. Something of that kind." Miss Marple asked, Would Mrs. Whitcomb have recognised a bitter taste? Perhaps. Depends on the preparation, and on whether she expected it. That was very much what Miss Marple had thought. A poison taken unexpectedly was one thing. A poison taken in trust was quite another. Later they passed Rosewood Manor. The gates were closed now, though not locked. A constable stood near the entrance with the solemn importance village constables wore in moments of significance. The garden beyond seemed changed, not because it was altered, but because it was ownerless. Beauty under such circumstances acquired a peculiar chill. A young woman was just emerging from the side path. She wore a dark cardigan over a pale blouse, and her face, though pretty in a fragile way, was strained from recent tears or perhaps long anxiety. Mrs. Finch touched Miss Marple's arm. "That is Iris," she murmured, "Mrs. Whitcomb's niece." Iris Whitcomb saw them and hesitated. Then, as though needing the steadiness of ordinary politeness, she came forward. "Mrs. Finch," she said quietly. "Miss Marple." "My dear child," Mrs. Finch said gently. "How dreadful for you." Iris gave a brittle nod. "Yes, I still can't quite believe it." Miss Marple watched her closely. Grief was present, certainly, but it was not the only thing. There was strain there, and fear, and something else harder to place. Relief, perhaps, or the terrible beginning of freedom. "Were you living here with your aunt?" Miss Marple asked in her mildest voice. "For the last 6 months?" That must have been a comfort to her. Iris looked toward the house. "I'm not sure my aunt found comfort easy." The words slipped out before she could stop them. She seemed to realise it at once and coloured. Mrs. Finch said quickly, "You mustn't tire yourself with talk." "No," said Iris. "No, perhaps not." But Miss Marple, whose gaze had followed the girl's involuntary glance, noticed another figure in the garden path beyond the shrubs. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, in gardening clothes that were too practical to belong to a guest, and too rough to belong to a gentleman amateur. His expression, when he saw Iris speaking with them, changed at once from concentration to guardedness. "Who is that?" asked Miss Marple, though she already suspected. "The gardener," said Iris. "Stephen Vale. He helps with the grounds." Helps, thought Miss Marple. An interesting choice. Not manages, not tends. Helps. Stephen Vale came no nearer, but his eyes rested on Iris for a moment in a way that revealed more than courtesy. The girl saw it too and looked away almost sharply. A connection, Miss Marple thought. Perhaps innocent, perhaps not, but certainly important. Iris made some excuse and withdrew. Stephen remained where he was for a moment longer, then bent to his work with excessive attention. Mrs. Finch exhaled slowly as they walked on. "Poor child." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though I am not yet sure in what way." That evening, after supper, Mrs. Finch brought out an old village directory and several years' worth of flower exhibition programmes. She claimed it was because Miss Marple had expressed an interest in Rosemary's gardening culture, which was true in a very limited and tactical sense. Mrs. Whitcomb's name appeared again and again. First prize for roses, first prize for mixed borders, best private garden, special commendation for heritage blooms. The woman had not merely participated, she had dominated. On the third programme, tucked between pages, there fell out a folded scrap of paper. Mrs. Finch picked it up. How odd. Miss Marple held out her hand. The note was unsigned and written in a hurried hand. The garden keeps what the house cannot. Ask about the east hedge. Mrs. Finch stared. I've never seen that before. Miss Marple unfolded it fully, then smoothed it against her knee. No, she said quietly, but someone very much wanted it to be found. Outside, the wind moved through the darkening village. Somewhere beyond the lane, beyond the hedges and the ordered flower beds, a secret had already begun to lean toward daylight. And in Rosemere, where everyone claimed to know one another perfectly, the first real whisper of truth had at last been heard. Part 3. The East Hedge. Miss Marple did not sleep particularly well that night. It was not discomfort, nor age, nor even the unsettling nature of recent events that kept her wakeful. Rather, it was the quiet persistence of a thought that refused to settle, like a thread left loose in an otherwise carefully woven pattern. The garden keeps what the house cannot. The words had a deliberate quality to them. Not dramatic, not poetic for its own sake, but purposeful. Someone had written that note with intention, and with knowledge. By morning, Miss Marple had reached a conclusion that was to her quite simple. The east hedge must be examined. Rosemere was subdued in the early hours. The village, which had buzzed with speculation the day before, now seemed to draw inward, as though uncertain whether to continue whispering or to pretend that silence might undo what had already occurred. Miss Marple, however, had no patience for such hesitation. After breakfast, she suggested another walk. Mrs. Finch hesitated. "Do you think that is wise? The police are about, and I should imagine they would prefer—" "My dear Eleanor," Miss Marple said gently, "the police prefer many things. That does not always mean they notice everything." There was no arguing with that, not when it was delivered in such a mild tone, and so, with a degree of quiet determination, they made their way once more toward Rosewood Manor. The constable at the gate recognised them and straightened slightly, though his expression suggested uncertainty. "I'm afraid visitors aren't really permitted at the moment," he said. Miss Marple smiled at him kindly. "Of course not, and quite right too. We should not dream of interfering." The young man relaxed a fraction. "We were only hoping to speak with Miss Whitcomb," Mrs. Finch added gently. "Poor thing, she must be quite alone." That, as Miss Marple well knew, was a far more difficult request to refuse. After a moment's consideration, the constable nodded. "Very well, but please don't wander about." "Certainly not," said Miss Marple. They passed through the gates. Miss Marple did not hurry. There was no need. People who hurried in such situations invited attention, and attention was rarely useful unless one intended to make a scene. Instead, she walked at a measured pace, her eyes taking in every detail with the same calm curiosity she might have applied to a knitting pattern. The garden appeared unchanged, but then, of course, that was precisely the point. Iris Whitcomb was in the drawing-room when they were shown in. She looked pale, though more composed than the day before. "I'm glad you came," she said with a faint, tired smile. "It's been rather overwhelming." "My dear child," Mrs. Finch said warmly, "you mustn't feel obliged to see anyone." "I think I prefer it," Iris admitted. "Otherwise one is left alone with one's thoughts." Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting once again in her hands. "And thoughts, I have often found, can be most unreliable companions." Iris gave a small, almost grateful laugh. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I think that's true." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but not entirely at ease either. Miss Marple broke it gently. "You'd been living here for some time, I believe." 6 months, Iris said. "After my aunt wrote to me. She said she needed help with the house and the garden." "The garden?" Miss Marple repeated softly. Iris's gaze flickered, just for a moment. Yes, it meant everything to her. "And to you?" Iris hesitated. "I tried to take an interest," she said carefully, "but I'm afraid I never quite understood it in the same way." Miss Marple nodded, as though this were perfectly natural. "Gardens can be very particular things. They reflect their owners, you see. Not everyone finds them easy to read." Iris looked at her, a faint unease returning to her expression. "What do you mean?" "Oh, only that one must know what to look for," Miss Marple said lightly. "Certain arrangements, certain choices, they are rarely accidental." Iris did not reply. Instead, she rose rather abruptly. "Would you like some tea?" Mrs. Finch began to protest, but Miss Marple said, "That would be lovely." As Iris left the room, Miss Marple's gaze drifted briefly toward the window. From there, one could just glimpse the far edge of the garden and the east hedge. It was not long before opportunity presented itself. The sound of voices in the hallway, the constable speaking with someone at the door, drew Mrs. Finch's attention. She rose instinctively. "I should just see—" "Yes, of course," Miss Marple said, and then quite naturally she found herself alone, for perhaps a minute. No more, but a minute Miss Marple knew was often quite sufficient. She set her knitting aside and rose, moving with a quiet efficiency that would have surprised anyone who considered her merely a gentle old lady. The garden door was slightly ajar. She stepped through it without hesitation. The air outside was still, carrying the faint scent of roses and damp earth. Miss Marple walked along the path with careful precision, her eyes fixed ahead. She did not look around unnecessarily. She did not pause. She went directly to the east hedge. Up close, the imperfection was clearer. Where the rest of the garden was maintained with meticulous care, this section bore signs of recent disturbance. The soil at its base was slightly uneven, the leaves not quite as neatly trimmed. Someone had worked here recently. Miss Marple crouched, ignoring entirely the impropriety of the action. Her fingers moved gently through the leaves, then to the soil beneath. There, something solid, not stone, not root. Carefully she brushed away a small amount of earth. A corner of something emerged. Wood. A box. Miss Marple paused, listening. Voices still inside the house, no footsteps approaching. With delicate movements she freed the object from the soil. It was a small wooden box, plain and unmarked. Not new, but not old enough to be forgotten by accident. Hidden deliberately. Miss Marple did not open it immediately. Instead, she slipped it quietly into the deep pocket of her coat. There would be time for examination later. Just as she straightened, a voice behind her said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Miss Marple turned. Stephen Vale stood a few paces away, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Miss Marple smiled, as though nothing at all were amiss. "My dear man," she said, "I was merely admiring the hedge." Stephen's gaze did not shift. People who admire hedges don't usually dig in them. "Ah," said Miss Marple, with a faint chuckle. "You would be surprised." He stepped closer. "Perhaps," he said, "but I don't think I am in this case." There was no hostility in his tone. But there was something else. Awareness. Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "You take your work very seriously, Mr. Vale." "I take it as it is," he replied, "and I notice when things are not as they should be." "An excellent quality," said Miss Marple, "though it can be inconvenient at times." "For some people," he agreed. They stood in silence for a moment longer. Then, quite unexpectedly, Stephen said, "You should be careful." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Of what?" He glanced briefly toward the house. "Of assuming the garden belongs to the dead." And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. When Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, she was once again the picture of quiet composure. Iris was pouring tea, her hands only slightly unsteady. Mrs. Finch was speaking of something entirely inconsequential. No one remarked on Miss Marple's brief absence. But as she took her seat and accepted her cup, her thoughts were already far from the polite conversation unfolding around her. The box lay hidden in her pocket, and whatever it contained, she felt certain of one thing. The garden had not merely witnessed a crime, it had been part of it. And somewhere within its careful beauty, something had been planted long before Mrs. Whitcomb's death. Something that was never meant to be found. Part 4. What the garden hid Miss Marple did not open the box immediately. There are, she had often believed, two kinds of discovery. The first is impulsive, the eager tearing away of mystery in the hope of quick understanding. The second is patient, deliberate, and far more revealing. It allows the mind to settle, to consider not only what has been found, but why it was hidden in the first place. And so, when she and Mrs. Finch returned to the cottage, Miss Marple placed her gloves neatly on the table, resumed her seat by the window, and took up her knitting as though nothing at all had occurred. Mrs. Finch, however, was not so composed. "You disappeared rather suddenly," she said, trying to sound casual and failing quite entirely. "Did I?" Miss Marple replied gently. "I had not noticed." "Miss Marple?" There was a pause, then with a small sigh Miss Marple reached into her coat pocket and drew out the wooden box. Mrs. Finch gasped. "Good heavens, where did you—" "In the east hedge," Miss Marple said simply. Mrs. Finch sat down rather abruptly. "You took it." "My dear Eleanor," Miss Marple said, "it was hidden. One does not hide things in gardens unless one hopes they will remain undiscovered. But surely this is a matter for the police." "Undoubtedly," said Miss Marple, "but the police do not yet know what they are looking for, and until they do, they may fail to recognise it when they see it." Mrs. Finch stared at the box as though it might begin speaking at any moment. "Do you think it has something to do with—" "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, "I do." She placed the box carefully on the table between them. It was a modest thing, unpolished wood, slightly worn at the edges. There was no lock, only a small clasp. Miss Marple did not open it at once. Instead, she studied it. "People choose hiding places for reasons," she said. "Sometimes convenience, sometimes panic, but often symbolism." Mrs. Finch blinked. "Symbolism?" "Yes. And one hides a thing where it belongs, or where it will not be questioned." She rested her hand lightly on the lid. A garden is a place of growth, she continued, but it is also a place where things are buried, quietly, respectably. With that, she opened the box. Inside were 3 items: a small glass vial, a folded letter, and a brooch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mrs. Finch leaned forward. "What is it?" Miss Marple picked up the vial first. It was nearly empty, containing only the faintest trace of a dark residue along its inner surface. The glass was clear, unmarked, ordinary, and therefore easily overlooked. "Poison, I should think," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Finch drew back slightly. "But why keep it?" "Because," said Miss Marple, "someone wished to keep it from being found elsewhere." She set the vial aside and turned to the letter. The paper was of good quality, though creased from folding. The handwriting was firm, controlled, but there was a tension in it, as though the writer had been determined to remain composed. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. She read in silence, then again. Mrs. Finch waited, her hands clasped tightly. "Well?" she asked at last. Miss Marple looked up. "It is from Mrs. Whitcomb," she said, "and it was never meant to be sent." "To whom?" "That," Miss Marple replied, "is the most interesting part." She handed the letter across. Mrs. Finch read aloud, her voice unsteady. "I cannot continue in this manner. The arrangement was never meant to last, and yet you persist as though time itself can be bent to your will. You mistake my silence for agreement, which it is not. I have tolerated more than I should have, and I will do so no longer. If you force my hand, I will speak, and when I do, it will not be a private matter, a W." Mrs. Finch lowered the paper slowly. "This is a threat." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "a very quiet one, but a threat nonetheless." "But to whom?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted briefly toward the window. "That," she said softly, "is what we must determine." The brooch lay at the bottom of the box. It was delicate, silver set with a small arrangement of dark stones that caught the light in a subdued, almost secretive way. It was not ostentatious, but it was distinctive. Mrs. Finch frowned. "I don't recognize it." Miss Marple turned it over. There on the back was a small engraving. Not a name, an initial. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "Iris," Mrs. Finch said faintly. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "but surely you don't think—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that objects have a habit of telling the truth even when people do not." She closed the box again. "There are several possibilities," she continued. "The brooch may belong to Miss Whitcomb, or it may have been placed there deliberately. The letter suggests a conflict, one serious enough to provoke a threat. And the vial," she glanced at it briefly, "the vial is the most dangerous of all. Not because of what it is, but because of what it proves." Mrs. Finch looked pale. "This is all so dreadful." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it usually is." There was a knock at the door. Both women started slightly. Mrs. Finch rose at once. "I'll see who it is." Miss Marple remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the closed box. Voices sounded in the hallway, then footsteps. Inspector Hale entered the room. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all," said Miss Marple. His eyes moved briefly over the table, noting the box, the vial, the letter. He was not a man who missed much. "I've come to ask a few further questions," he said. "New information has come to light." Miss Marple inclined her head. "As it often does." He hesitated. Then, quite directly, he said, "We've established that Mrs. Whitcomb was not alone in the garden yesterday evening." Mrs. Finch gasped. "Someone saw her." "A passing labourer," the inspector replied. "He didn't think much of it at the time, but he recalls seeing her speaking with a man near the far hedge." Miss Marple's gaze did not shift. "The east hedge?" she asked. "Yes." There was a brief silence. Inspector Hale studied her. "You seem unsurprised." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, in a village such as this, people rarely choose their meeting places at random." His eyes flicked once more to the box. "And what," he asked carefully, "have you found?" Miss Marple considered him for a moment. Then she reached forward and opened the box once more. "I believe," she said quietly, "that the garden has begun to speak." Outside, the afternoon light softened, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Rosemere. The village continued its careful performance of normality. But beneath that surface something had shifted. A letter had been written. A threat had been made. A meeting had taken place. And now, at last, the first pieces of truth had been uncovered. Not in the house, but in the garden, where nothing, it seemed, had ever truly been allowed to die. Part 5. Roots of Resentment. Inspector Hale did not speak for several moments after Miss Marple revealed the contents of the box. He stood by the table, his posture still, his expression thoughtful, not startled, not dramatic, but quietly recalculating. It was the look of a man adjusting the shape of a problem he had believed to be simpler. Finally, he reached for the letter. "This was written by Mrs. Whitcomb," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And hidden? Along with what appears to be the poison used to kill her? That would seem likely." Inspector Hale turned the paper over in his hands. "And you chose not to inform us immediately?" Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "I chose first to understand what I had found." He considered that, then nodded once. "Fair enough." Mrs. Finch, who had remained unusually silent, spoke at last. "Inspector, does this mean her killer is someone she knew?" Inspector Hale gave a thin, humourless smile. "In my experience, it almost always does." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Particularly when poison is involved." The inspector looked at her. "You agree, then? This wasn't random." "No," said Miss Marple. "It was personal and deliberate." She paused, then added quietly, "and very likely long in the making." By late afternoon, the atmosphere in Rosemere had begun to change. Speculation, which had previously been scattered and uncertain, now started to gather direction. News of the poison had settled into certainty, and with certainty came something more dangerous: suspicion. Miss Marple observed it all with quiet attention. There was Mrs. Harbury, who spoke too often and too loudly of how unthinkable such a crime was, yet asked very precise questions about Mrs. Whitcomb's finances. There was Mr. Pritchard, whose concerns seemed genuine but whose memory of small details, who had visited whom and when, was remarkably sharp. And there was the vicar, whose kindness was unshaken, but whose eyes lingered just a moment too long on certain members of his congregation. Patterns, Miss Marple thought, were forming, and patterns once begun were rarely accidental. That evening, Miss Marple requested a visit to the manor once more. Inspector Hale agreed, though not without a certain reservation. "I should prefer that you leave the questioning to me," he said. "Of course," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, which, as Mrs. Finch knew from long experience, did not necessarily mean that she would. Iris Whitcomb received them in the drawing-room again. This time, however, she seemed less composed. There was a strain about her, a restlessness that had not been there before. Her hands moved more than necessary, adjusting small objects, smoothing the fabric of her dress as though attempting to impose order on something that refused to be settled. "Inspector," she said, managing a polite smile. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Finch." "Miss Whitcomb," said Inspector Hale, his tone formal but not unkind. "I'm afraid I must ask you a few questions." "Of course." He did not sit. "Can you tell me where you were yesterday evening?" "Between 6 and 8. Iris hesitated, only briefly, but Miss Marple noticed. "I was in the house," she said. "I had a headache. I lay down for a while." "Alone?" "Yes." "No one saw you?" "I don't believe so." Inspector Hale nodded slowly. "And your aunt?" "She said she was going to the garden." "Did she mention meeting anyone?" "No." There was a pause. Then carefully the inspector said, "Miss Whitcomb, were you aware that your aunt had disagreements with anyone in the village?" Iris looked genuinely uncertain. "She was particular," she said. "She liked things done a certain way that sometimes caused tension." "With whom?" Iris hesitated again. "Mr. Vale, perhaps," she said. "The gardener. They argued sometimes." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "About what?" asked the inspector. "About the garden," Iris said quickly. "He had his own ideas. My aunt did not appreciate them." Inspector Hale made a note. "And anyone else?" Iris shook her head. "No one serious." Miss Marple spoke then, her voice gentle. "Did your aunt ever speak of being threatened?" Iris looked at her sharply. "No," she said. "Why would she be?" Miss Marple held her gaze for a moment, then smiled faintly. "People are threatened for all sorts of reasons," she said. "Often by things that seem quite small at first." Iris said nothing, but the unease in her expression deepened. Afterward, they spoke with Stephen Vale. He was found near the tool shed, his sleeves rolled up, his hands marked with soil. He did not appear surprised to see them. "Inspector," he said, "Miss Marple." "You knew Mrs. Whitcomb well," the inspector began. "Well enough," Stephen replied. "You worked here regularly?" "Yes." "Miss Whitcomb mentioned that you and Mrs. Whitcomb sometimes disagreed." Stephen gave a short, almost humourless smile. "She liked control," he said. "I liked results. Those two things don't always agree." "Did you argue with her yesterday?" Stephen hesitated. "Yes," he said at last. "About what?" "The east hedge." Miss Marple's eyes did not leave his face. "And what about it?" asked Inspector Hale. "It needed clearing," Stephen said. "Properly. The soil was wrong. Something had been buried there. Something that shouldn't have been." "And Mrs. Whitcomb objected?" "She said it was not my concern." There was a pause. "Did you meet her in the garden later that evening?" the inspector asked. Stephen looked at him steadily. "Yes." Miss Marple felt rather than saw Mrs. Finch stiffen beside her. "You admit that?" said the inspector. "I've no reason not to," Stephen replied. "I spoke to her. We argued again, then I left." "At what time?" "Just before 7. "And she was alive when you left?" "Yes." "Did you give her anything to drink?" "No." "Did you see anyone else?" Stephen hesitated, just for a moment. "No," he said. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Mr. Vale," she said softly, "you strike me as a man who notices things." "I do." "Then I wonder," she continued, "why you did not notice anything unusual in the garden yesterday evening." Stephen met her gaze. "I noticed enough," he said, "and yet you choose not to say what it was." A flicker of something passed across his expression. "Not yet," he replied. That night, as Miss Marple sat once more by the window, the pieces began to settle into place, not clearly, not completely, but enough to suggest a shape. There was the letter, a threat, quiet but unmistakable. There was the meeting by the east hedge, where something had been hidden. There was the brooch, bearing the initial I. And there were the people. Iris, uncertain, anxious, perhaps hiding something. Stephen, observant, guarded, withholding. And Mrs. Whitcomb herself, controlled, composed, and at the end afraid enough to write a warning she never sent. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "It is always the same," she said softly. Mrs. Finch looked up. "What is?" "The roots," Miss Marple replied. "The roots of what?" Miss Marple's gaze moved to the darkness beyond the window. "Of resentment," she said. "They grow quietly, beneath the surface, unseen, until one day," she paused, "they break through." Outside, the wind moved gently through the village, and somewhere, beneath the carefully tended beauty of Rosemere, something far older than the murder itself had begun to show. Part 6. The Bloom of Truth. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual the next morning. There are moments in any investigation when the air itself seems to change, when scattered impressions begin to settle into something more deliberate. It is not quite certainty, but it is no longer confusion. It is the quiet approach of understanding. She dressed with care, as always, and took her breakfast without haste. Mrs. Finch watched her with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "You look as though you have decided something," she said at last. Miss Marple buttered her toast thoughtfully. "Not decided, my dear. Merely arranged." "Arranged?" "Yes. Oh, one must arrange facts as one would flowers. Place them properly and the pattern becomes visible." Mrs. Finch did not find this particularly reassuring. "And is the pattern unpleasant?" Miss Marple gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. "They usually are." By mid-morning, Miss Marple requested that Inspector Hale join them once more at the cottage. He arrived promptly, his manner composed but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. The discovery of the box had shifted matters significantly, and he knew it. "You wish to speak with me?" he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I believe it is time to consider not only what happened, but why it happened in precisely the way it did." Inspector Hale nodded. "Go on." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "We have a woman who is careful, controlled, and accustomed to managing her surroundings. She writes a letter, one that suggests pressure, perhaps even coercion. She arranges a meeting in her garden, at a place where something has been hidden, and then she is poisoned. which suggests premeditation, the inspector said. Indeed, Miss Marple replied. But not only that, it suggests familiarity. Whoever killed her knew her habits, knew her trust, and most importantly, knew the garden. Inspector Hale's expression sharpened. You believe the garden itself is central to the crime? I do, said Miss Marple, because Mrs. Whitcomb did. There was a brief silence. Then Miss Marple added very quietly, and because she was not the only one who knew what was buried there. They returned to Rosewood Manor once more. This time, however, Miss Marple's purpose was clear. She asked quite directly to speak with Iris Whitcomb alone. The request was unusual enough to draw a brief look from Inspector Hale, but he did not object. Iris received her in the smaller sitting room, her expression tense. Miss Marple, is something wrong? My dear, Miss Marple said gently, something has been wrong for quite some time. Iris sank into a chair. I don't understand. Miss Marple sat opposite her, her voice calm, almost kind. Your aunt was not an easy woman, I think. Iris looked down. She had strong opinions. And strong expectations, Miss Marple added. Yes. There are such women, Miss Marple continued, who believe that order must be maintained at all costs. That control is a form of safety. Iris's hands tightened in her lap. She only wanted things to be right. Did she? Miss Marple said softly. Or did she want them to remain as they were? Iris did not answer. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. You see, my dear, people who insist on perfection often do so because something imperfect lies beneath it. Iris's breath caught. What do you mean? Miss Marple studied her for a moment. Tell me, she said, how long had your aunt been using the East Hedge as a hiding place? The effect was immediate. Iris's composure broke. I don't know what you're talking about, she said quickly. Miss Marple did not raise her voice. No, she said, but you do know. Silence. Then very slowly Iris said, I found something a few weeks ago. Miss Marple nodded. In the hedge? Yes. What was it? Iris hesitated. A box, she said, with letters and other things. Did your aunt know you had found it? Iris looked up, her eyes filled with something close to fear. Yes. And what did she say? She told me to forget it, Iris said. She said it was none of my concern, that it was from a long time ago. Miss Marple's voice softened. But you did not forget. No, Iris whispered. I couldn't. Because you understood what it meant. Iris covered her face briefly with her hands. It meant she had been lying, she said, for years, about everything. Miss Marple said nothing. After a moment, Iris continued, her voice trembling. The letters, they were from my mother. Before she died, she had written to my aunt. She was asking for help, money, a place to stay. She was desperate. Miss Marple's eyes grew very still. And your aunt? She never answered, Iris said. She kept the letters, hid them, and let my mother, her voice broke, she let her die. The room was very quiet. Miss Marple spoke at last. And when you discovered this, you confronted her, Iris nodded. She said it was not her responsibility, that my mother had made her own choices, that it was better this way. There was a pause, and you did not agree. No, Miss Marple regarded her gently. So you wrote to her, she said. Iris looked up, startled. The letter we found, Miss Marple continued, it was not written to you. It was written by her, to someone who knew the truth. Iris's expression shifted. To Stephen, she said quietly. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. Later, Miss Marple spoke with Stephen Vale once more. This time there was no attempt at evasion. You knew about the letters, she said. Yes. And about Iris. Yes. You cared for her. Stephen did not answer immediately. Yes, he said at last. And you wanted her to know the truth. She had a right to know, Miss Marple nodded, but Mrs. Whitcomb disagreed. She always disagreed, Stephen said bitterly. She controlled everything, the house, the garden, the past. And so, Miss Marple said quietly, something had to change. Stephen looked at her sharply. What are you suggesting? Miss Marple held his gaze. I am suggesting, she said, that the truth had been buried for a very long time, and that when it began to surface, someone decided it would be buried again. There was a long silence. Then Stephen said, You're wrong. Miss Marple did not argue. Instead, she said softly, Perhaps. That evening Miss Marple sat once more by the window. The pieces had shifted again, the letters, the hidden box, the past that had been concealed, not out of forgetfulness, yes, but out of deliberate choice. Mrs. Whitcomb had not simply been controlling, she had been protecting something, or perhaps protecting herself. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "It is never only about the present," she said quietly. Mrs. Finch looked at her. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's gaze moved toward the dark outline of the village beyond. "Murder," she said, "is very often the end of a story that began long before anyone thought to pay attention." She paused, and in this case, her voice softened. "It began with a choice, a very quiet, very ordinary choice, the sort that seemed small at the time." Mrs. Finch shivered slightly. "And now?" Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. "Now," she said, "we must see who has been tending it all these years." Outside. The garden of Rosewood Manor lay still beneath the fading light, but beneath its careful beauty the truth had begun to bloom, and it would not be contained much longer. Part 7. The Poison. Among Petals. By the following morning Rosemere had reached that delicate stage where fear begins to harden into certainty, but certainty without direction is a dangerous thing. Miss Marple, however, no longer dealt in uncertainty. She had asked Inspector Hale to gather everyone connected to Mrs. Whitcomb at Rosewood Manor that afternoon. It was, she explained, the simplest way to avoid prolonged misunderstanding. The inspector had hesitated, as sensible men often did when faced with quiet confidence, but he agreed. And so, as the light softened into early evening, the drawing room of Rosewood Manor filled once more. Iris Whitcomb sat near the window, and pale but composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Stephen Vale stood apart from the others, his posture guarded, his expression closed. Mrs. Finch was present, though she looked distinctly uncomfortable. Inspector Hale remained near the fireplace, watchful. Miss Marple took her seat with the calm authority of someone who required no announcement. For a moment no one spoke. Then Miss Marple began. "It is a curious thing," she said gently, "how often a garden is treated as something purely decorative, a place of beauty, of peace." Her eyes moved slowly across the room. But in truth a garden is something far more complicated. It is a place where things are grown, and where things are hidden. There was a faint shift in the atmosphere. Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Whitcomb's garden was by all accounts perfect, carefully arranged, controlled, nothing out of place, and yet, beneath that perfection, something had been buried. She paused, letting the words settle. The past. Iris lowered her gaze. Stephen did not move. Miss Marple went on. Years ago, Mrs. Whitcomb made a choice, a quiet one, perhaps even a practical one at the time. She chose not to help her sister, Miss Iris's mother, when she was in need. Mrs. Finch drew in a soft breath. That choice, Miss Marple said, was not visible. It did not disturb the surface of things. Life continued. The garden flourished. The village admired. Her voice softened slightly. But such choices do not disappear. They take root. They grow quietly, unseen, until something brings them to light. Inspector Hale spoke then. The letters? Yes, said Miss Marple, hidden in the east hedge, preserved, not destroyed. Ah, that is important, you see. Mrs. Whitcomb could not quite bring herself to eliminate them entirely, so she buried them, where she believed they would remain forgotten. Stephen shifted slightly. Miss Marple noticed, but did not acknowledge it directly. Then, she continued, Miss Iris arrived, and quite by chance, she discovered the truth. Iris's voice was barely audible. I wasn't meant to. No, said Miss Marple gently, but you did, and once such a truth is uncovered, it cannot easily be set aside. She turned her attention to Stephen. And you, Mr. Vale, you also knew. Stephen's jaw tightened. Yes, he said. You encouraged Miss Iris to confront her aunt. I encouraged her to understand, he replied. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Perhaps. But understanding can be disruptive. She allowed a brief silence before continuing. Mrs. Whitcomb, faced with this, wrote a letter, a warning, not to Miss Iris, but to you, Mr. Vale. Stephen did not deny it. She feared exposure, Miss Marple said. Not scandal, perhaps, But the loss of control, the loss of the narrative she had maintained for so long. Inspector Hale stepped forward slightly. "And so she arranged to meet someone in the garden," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "at the east hedge, where the truth had been hidden." Her voice remained calm. But here is the important point. Mrs. Whitcomb did not go to that meeting expecting to die. She went expecting to resolve matters, to restore order. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly between Iris and Stephen. And that is why the poison must have been given in something she trusted, something familiar, something she would not question. Mrs. Finch whispered, "Tea?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "or something similar, but not something forced. No struggle, no fear, until it was too late." Inspector Hale frowned slightly. "But that still leaves the question of who administered it." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it does." She folded her hands neatly. "And the answer lies not in anger alone, but in opportunity." The room grew very still. Miss Marple's eyes rested finally on Iris. "My dear," she said gently, "you told us that you were in the house that evening, resting, alone." Iris did not look up. "Yes." "And yet," Miss Marple continued softly, "you knew about the meeting. You knew where your aunt would be. And you had every reason to speak with her yourself." Iris's breath quickened. "I didn't..." Miss Marple raised a hand slightly, not to silence her but to steady the moment. "I do not think," she said, "that you intended to kill her." That made Iris look up. "I didn't," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear I didn't." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you, because this was not a crime born of sudden violence. It was quieter than that." She turned unexpectedly to Stephen. "And you, Mr. Vale, you had knowledge, you had motive perhaps, but you also had something else." Stephen met her gaze. "What?" "Restraint," Miss Marple said. A flicker of something passed through his expression. "You could have acted," she continued, "but you did not. Instead, you waited, you watched." Inspector Hale spoke again. "Then who—" Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. "It is often the case," she said, "that when two people are in conflict, we look only at them. We assume that the outcome must belong to one or the other." She paused. "But sometimes," her voice grew quieter, "there is a third presence, one less obvious, one who observes and waits." The silence in the room deepened. Miss Marple's gaze shifted, not to Iris nor to Stephen, but toward the doorway. "Someone," she said, "who understood the garden very well." And as she spoke, a shadow moved just beyond the threshold. Inspector Hale turned sharply. "Who's there?" The constable stepped forward at once, revealing the figure who had been standing just out of sight. It was Dr. Bellamy. For a moment no one spoke. Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "My dear doctor," she said softly, I think it is time we spoke of plants." Outside, the evening light settled over Rosemere. The garden at Rosewood Manor stood as it always had, orderly, beautiful, and silent. But within the house, the truth had finally begun to take its final shape. And like all things that grow beneath the surface, it had taken root long before anyone thought to look. Part 8. The Garden's Final Secret. Conclusion. Dr. Bellamy did not immediately step forward. For a brief moment he remained where he was, half within the shadow of the doorway, half within the soft lamplight of the room. It was an oddly fitting image, Miss Marple thought. A man suspended between what was known and what had yet to be admitted. Inspector Hale moved first. "Doctor," he said, his tone firm, "perhaps you would care to explain why you were listening outside the door." "Doctor." Bellamy gave a small measured sigh and stepped fully into the room. "I wasn't listening," he said calmly. "I was arriving, though I imagine the distinction will not be of much importance now." Miss Marple watched him closely. "No," she said gently, "I rather think it will not." The room seemed to contract around them, every presence drawn inward toward the quiet centre of accusation that had not yet fully formed, but could no longer be avoided. Inspector Hale folded his arms. "You have something to say, Doctor?" Dr. Bellamy glanced at him, then at Miss Marple. "It seems," he said, "that Miss Marple has something to say." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Only what has already been made quite clear," she replied. She turned slightly, addressing the room, not dramatically, not forcefully, but with that quiet certainty that demanded attention without ever asking for it. "We have spoken of the past," she said, "of buried truths, of resentment, of the slow and patient growth of consequences. But there remains one question that has not yet been properly answered." Her gaze returned to Dr. Bellamy. Who understood the garden well enough to use it, not merely as a setting, but as a weapon? No one spoke. Miss Marple continued. "Poison is a very particular method. It requires knowledge, not only of substances, but of their effects, of timing, of dosage. It is not the choice of someone acting in sudden passion." Her voice softened. "It is the choice of someone who plans." Dr. Bellamy did not look away. "You are suggesting," he said evenly, "that I poisoned Mrs. Whitcomb." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that you were uniquely placed to do so." Inspector Hale's eyes narrowed. "Doctor," he said, "you confirmed the cause of death. You examined the body." "Yes." "And you identified the poison?" "Yes." Miss Marple spoke again gently. "A plant-derived toxin," she said. "Quite correct, but not one commonly encountered. Not one easily recognized, unless one already knew what to look for." Dr. Bellamy's expression remained calm. "I'm a doctor, Miss Marple. That is precisely what I am trained to do." "Yes," she said, "but you're also a gardener." There was the smallest pause. Miss Marple went on. "I noticed it when we first spoke. Your familiarity with the garden was not casual. You knew its structure, its species, its possibilities." She took a small step forward. "And more importantly, you knew Mrs. Whitcomb trusted you." "Mrs." Finch let out a faint breath. "Of course," she whispered. "The doctor, she would never suspect." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Exactly." Inspector Hale turned sharply to Dr. Bellamy. "You were seen in the vicinity that evening," he said. "Were you in the garden?" Dr. Bellamy did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Yes." A ripple of tension moved through the room. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "You met her?" she said. "Yes." "And you spoke?" "Yes." "And at some point," Miss Marple continued, "you gave her something." Dr. Bellamy's eyes flickered. Not with fear, but with something more complex. Resignation. "She trusted me," he said simply. The words settled heavily in the air. Inspector Hale stepped forward. "You poisoned her." Dr. Bellamy closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," Iris gasped softly. Stephen's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple spoke again, her voice quiet. "Why?" Dr. Bellamy opened his eyes. For the first time, there was something unguarded in them. "Because she deserved it," he said. The words were not loud, but they carried. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "Did she?" Dr. Bellamy's composure faltered. "Not entirely, but enough." "You know what she did," he said. "You've spoken of it. She let her own sister die. She buried the truth. She lived comfortably, admired, respected, while others suffered for her decisions." His voice tightened. "And she would have continued. She would have silenced it again, controlled it, erased it." Miss Marple said nothing. Dr. Bellamy continued. "I knew about the letters," he said. "Years ago. I treated her sister briefly. I saw the desperation. I knew she had written. And I knew Mrs. Whitcomb had ignored her." Iris stared at him. "You knew?" she whispered. "Yes," he said, "and I said nothing. At the time, I told myself it was not my place." He laughed softly, a hollow sound. "But it was always my place. I simply chose not to act." Miss Marple's eyes softened just slightly. "And so, years later," she said, "you decided to correct that choice." "Yes." Inspector Hale's voice was firm. "That is not justice. That is murder." Dr. Bellamy looked at him. "I am aware of the distinction." There was silence. Then Miss Marple spoke once more. "You chose the garden," she said, "because it mattered to her." "Yes." "And you used something she would not question." "Yes." "And afterward," Miss Marple added quietly, "you allowed suspicion to fall elsewhere." Dr. Bellamy did not deny it. "I did." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It is always the same," she said. "We believe we are correcting the past, but in doing so, we only create another wrong." Dr. Bellamy's shoulders seemed to lower just slightly. "Perhaps," he said. Inspector Hale stepped forward. "Dr. Bellamy," he said, "I must ask you to come with me." Dr. Bellamy did not resist. As he was led from the room, Iris remained motionless, her face pale, her eyes distant. Stephen stood still, his expression unreadable, and Miss Marple returned quietly to her seat. Later, as the house grew still and the weight of what had occurred began to settle, Mrs. Finch spoke in a low voice. "It's over," she said. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No," she said. "It is never entirely over." Mrs. Finch looked at her. "But the truth has come out." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "But truth does not undo what has been done. It merely explains it." She glanced toward the window where the garden lay silent beneath the fading light. "Mrs. Whitcomb made a choice many years ago," she said. "A quiet one that seemed small at the time." Mrs. Finch nodded slowly. "And it grew," she said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "as such things do." She paused, then added softly, "And in the end, it bore fruit." The flower exhibition in Rosemere was held as planned a week later. There were fewer entries than usual. The atmosphere was subdued, the conversations quieter. Mrs. Whitcomb's garden was not entered, though it remained in its way, as perfect as ever. But something had changed. The villagers no longer spoke of it in quite the same tone. There was admiration, yes, but also something else. Awareness, because now they knew that beneath the beauty, beneath the order and the careful arrangement, there had been something hidden. Something that had waited. Miss Marple, preparing to leave Rosemere, paused once more at the gates of Rosewood Manor. She looked at the garden, not with suspicion, nor with admiration, but with understanding. Gardens, she thought, were very much like people. They could be tended, they could be shaped, they could be made to appear perfect. But beneath the surface, there were always roots, and one could never be entirely certain what had been planted there. As her carriage carried her away from the village, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression calm. Another mystery resolved, another story completed. But as always, she did not feel satisfaction, only a quiet, thoughtful acceptance. Because she knew, as few did, either that the world was not divided between good and evil in any simple way. It was far more complicated than that, and far more human. And in places like Rosemere, where everything seemed so carefully arranged, that truth was often the most dangerous thing of all.